Late 2017, early 2018, I started making a series of videos in which I was warning Zimbabweans that the Zimbabwean government was having secret negotiations with the British government that included the British government pressuring the Zimbabwean government to compensate white farmers for developments made on land. I asked the Zimbabwean people to join us in writing petitions to stop the British government from pressuring the Zimbabwean government because it is an injustice for us to compensate vandalism on our own land. As usual, Zimbabweans were not interested, they were indifferent, and they obviously thought that people like me just like to speak for attention. I now understand from a morning paper today that the Zimbabwean government has made an offer of $3 billion as compensation to white farmers. There is negotiations taking place. The white farmers themselves want $10 billion. The question now is, are we going to be able to afford this new debt when we've got $7 billion of currently unpaid debts?
Good evening, guys. It's been nearly 100 days since our new president has come into power. And obviously, we're getting to a point in time where we're going to have to do an analysis of the performance that Mnangagwa has given. And at the same time, we also look at a situation where, as active citizens, we've got to be the kind of people that are active enough to bring out the right messages, the right information for us to build and help build this nation of Zimbabwe. As part of active citizenry, we need to be people that get used to writing documents, writing proposals, making videos like this in order to speak to our leaders through the digital space. To a certain extent, the digital space has given us an opportunity to have a sort of people's parliament that can send messages through to the relevant people from platforms of social media that help us to bring our argument, our thoughts through to the leaders that be, particularly when they say that they are willing to hear from their people. Particular concern to me right now is the issue that our nation is looking at a situation where we need to pay anything between $7 to $8 billion to compensate white farmers for stolen land and the so-called developments that they made on land that they stole. This, for me, is unacceptable, and it also doesn't make sense. How is it that our ancestors who were displaced from their land, ancestors who were used as slave labor, as their land was taken away from them, their opportunities stolen, they didn't have jobs, never had an opportunity to learn, their livestock stolen, and their dreams stolen in their own country. And today, 90 years after we were colonized in 1890, we, the children, we, the inheritors of a country that was previously colonized, have got to pay some form of compensation to the same people that stole our land. Now, this doesn't make sense in any sphere of understanding. Human rights law, any form of contract law. For me, it is untenable for a person that lost their property to be paying the person that stole the property for damaging their property, for vandalizing their property. And the reason I use these words is deliberate. If you steal someone else's property and you make any changes to that property, you put anything on that property, it is not considered as developments, but it is actually considered as vandalism. So what was done to our land was vandalism. And when they vandalized our land, when they destroyed our land, when they damaged our land by doing things that we did not do in our culture, we are supposed to compensate them for that. It is also critical for us to understand that why we also call it vandalism is a lot of the activities that were undertaken on our land by white farmers and by the Rhodesian government are things that we did not use our own land for. For example, when white farmers got onto our land, they cut down trees in groves in areas that we used to call sacred, trees that we used to protect, and they they cut down those trees and put that timber into the mining industry. A lot of those places were sacred. Taidziti Rambotemwa. And in Rambotemwa, there were trees, old sacred trees, and forests and grasses that we never used to touch, that we never used to harvest, because we were preserving them. There was some form of conservation that was tied with spirituality on those pieces of land. Not only that, we also had what were called marshes. And in marshes, those are areas that are watery, they store water, and a lot of white farmers decided to grow crops in marshes because they would be able to have perpetual water and access to very rich minerals in those marshes. Now a lot of those marshes are dried up. A lot of those marshes don't exist anymore. And this is why you now see that the rivers in Zimbabwe will be dry during dry seasons, because those marshes were the ones that used to provide water. They were the watersheds for those rivers. There was also a lot of stream bank cultivation when Varungu came into our country. They would plant crops on the stream bank to get access to water easily, and also the rich nutrients that are found in stream banks, like you would find when you go through to Egypt. I'm sure you used to hear that the floodplains is where they used to grow their crops. A lot of white farmers grew crops there, and what that caused is siltation into our rivers, and that siltation is the reason why today we don't have any running water in a lot of our rivers. There was a lot of erosion as well that took place because of farming practices that were unenvironmentally friendly, that were implemented by white people for at least a 60-year period of time since they came into Rhodesia. Now you need to understand that we had our own land practices. They might sound archaic, they might sound backward to a lot of people, but they were actually very advanced, because today we're hearing white people talking about permaculture, trying to emulate some of the things that we used to do, some of the practices that we used to have. They want to bring them back. They damaged our land by doing what they called advanced farming. Not only that, they put chemicals into our soils, fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, all of which killed some of the soil bacteria that is in our soils, killed the fertility of our soils. They brought in monoculture. They brought in things like maize that was never grown in Africa, and that sucked all the nutrients out of the soil. It took out all the fortification that was put in by some of the grasses and small grains that we used to consume in Zimbabwe. All this is vandalism. All this is damage that was done by white farmers and Rhodesians to our soil, to our land, which is not development of the land. So with this vandalism, this destruction of the quality of our soils, the cutting down of our trees, we are the ones that are supposed to pay some form of compensation to white farmers for destroying our soils, for dispossessing our ancestors of their land resources. And you need to remember that when you lose your land, you're not just losing the earnings from that land, but you lose a whole lot of other things. You lose the ability to use the land. You lose your skill in the process. You lose your connection with that soil. You lose your culture in the process, and a whole lot of other immeasurable things that we lost, that our ancestors lost, all of which is affecting our ability to produce today. For that, we as Zimbabweans should be getting paid damages. For that, we should be getting paid restoration fees. For that, we should be paid loss of earnings. And for that, white Rhodesians must return to us what is called unjust enrichment. These are issues that I'm talking about that are in legal precedents of Roman Dutch law, English law, and American law. It's nothing out of the ordinary. And from that, remember that we were subjugated. We were people that the Rhodesians did to us what it is that Europe fought Germany for trying to do to Europe. Germany occupied France, Poland, and a number of other European countries, and the world went to war. Even the Rhodesians and our ancestors, black Zimbabweans, were taken to fight the Second World War to liberate France and a number of other European nations that had been occupied by Germany. But what is interesting is that that occupation is no different. The German occupation of European countries is no different to the occupation that happened to us by the British. Colonization was precisely what Germany was trying to do to France and other European countries. And nations went to war with Germany to defeat Germany, and after that, they made Germany pay reparations. In the same effect, our leaders, our ancestors who went to war to fight the Rhodesians for freedom, to fight the English for freedom, were entitled to reparations when they won the war. But they never got reparations because of unfair practice and what we call duress. When we were made to sit and have the negotiations at Lancaster, those negotiations were not had in good faith, but those negotiations were had in bad faith, where the English were sitting together with us and the Rhodesians, and as our leaders were fighting from the frontline states, Zambia, Tanzania, and Mozambique, they put pressure on these countries to chase out our leaders if our leaders refused to negotiate and accept the terms of the Lancaster House Conference. A deal was already put on the table by the British government, and that deal did not include reparations. It actually didn't even include land. So the issue was, if our leaders who had been outside the country for up to 17 years had refused the terms that had been put up at Lancaster, they were going to find themselves being left in exile and not having a base to fight the war from. So that was duress that was used to push our leaders into a quick agreement, into a quick acceptance of the terms of Lancaster House that was going to serve the British better than it served our ancestors. This is why there was no compensation for our ancestors. This is why there was no compensation for Zimbabweans. This is why there was no reparations. Yet, under international law, we were supposed to receive reparations. And under international law, it is clearly understood that any agreement that is reached under duress is now unvoidable. However, we are now living in 2018, and this very same legal system or international law that has seen the Lancaster House Conference being reneged upon by the British is now pushing us to pay compensation to white farmers. And when I ask some politicians to say, what are these compensations that need to be paid? They say that the compensation is simple. Our farmers, these white farmers, these Rhodesian farmers, these sons and daughters of thieves, had taken loans from international financial institutions for their farming activities in Zimbabwe. And to do that, they had mortgaged the very same land, our land that they did not have legal titles to. They had mortgaged that, and that's how the banks lent them the money. So today our government is being held accountable and is being held responsible for those debts, because the land that our government supposedly took was supposed to be the collateral. Now, in international law, in the law of contract, all that doesn't make sense. For those banks should have never lent money that the people that were borrowing did not have legal title to. It does not make sense to me that banks lent white farmers money based on the collateral of our land when they knew very well that that land had been acquired in colonization, which was a crime against humanity. In other words, they knew that this land was stolen. They knew that white farmers did not actually have the right to own this land, but they took it they lent money on that land anyway. That is voidable. It should not be the concern of the Zimbabwean citizen, the concern of the Zimbabwean government, and should not put the Zimbabwean government in a debt of 7 billion because of criminals that went to take a loan that a bank carelessly gave without looking at the risk analysis if they actually owned the asset. It was clear that white people never owned land in Zimbabwe. Someone else might even argue to say it is clear that white people in Australia do not legally own the land in Australia. So do the ones in New Zealand, and so do the ones in the United States of America. Yes, it's convenient for commerce for them to recognize title that is faulty in those countries. But the truth of the matter is, whenever you colonize, whenever you take something by force, you're a criminal, you're a thief, and that asset doesn't belong to you. So today our government, if it wants to go back into the international sphere, if it wants to re-engage the international community, the international Western community has conspired to agree that there must be compensation for white farmers who were occupying stolen land. Instead of it being the other way around, where white farmers and the British government compensate Zimbabweans for the crime of colonialism that took place, for the benefit that the British government had You understand? For 90 years, taking our minerals, taking our slave labor, not paying our ancestors, taking the opportunity from our ancestors and using that to build a 4% population of the Rhodesian population together with bolstering the English. Now, we are educated enough. We are that generation of black people that has got the master's degrees in LLBs and legal degrees. Why are we not using these legal degrees to contest some of these unfairnesses? To use the legal systems that are available to us in the world, the legal mechanisms, to start challenging some of these unfairnesses, challenging some of these injustices. And these can be challenged at many levels. Human rights law, contract law, international law, and many other legal branches that I might not know, but you as lawyers might understand better. There is a lot faulty about the negotiations that were reached that have continued to institute neo-colonialism on Africa. A lot of why Zimbabwe is why it's in the situation it's in is because Zimbabwe never received reparations or damages for any of the damage that was done to our people. And what a lot of people don't understand is that we complain about things like Gukura Hundi, but a lot of people don't recognize that the post-traumatic stress that was associated with us fighting for freedom, never getting counseling, never getting any money for our people to get counseling after they won the war, and after all the terror that was brought upon them in the 90 years of colonization and the 17 years of the war, in which the Rhodesian government used even illegal means of war. They contravened the Geneva Convention. They used military tactics that were illegal according to the Geneva Convention to terrorize our people. Those people with that post-traumatic stress disorder went in to become rulers of a nation and were bound to end up fighting with the divisions of tribalism that had been put in by the very same Rhodesians. So Gukura Hundi was always going to happen. And it was always going to happen because of a war that had terrorized and created men and women that no longer had the mindset to be just leaders of a nation without causing some of the troubles and problems that we eventually were able to work out. All these are issues we should be discussing. Instead of always looking at the white man's perspective and looking at his victimization, we need to start looking at ourselves and what happened to us and how that changed us and how that has caused some of the conditions that we're living in today. On top of that, not having compensated us, not having given us post-traumatic stress counseling, not having healed the nation, they still went on to impose sanctions because people wanted their land. They imposed sanctions because we had the audacity to challenge them to fulfill the terms and conditions of the Lancaster House Conference. We've got to start doing something about this situation. And it starts with those of you that are living in the United Kingdom. You have a petition system in the United Kingdom where we can petition the Parliament of the Great Britain, and we can have 100,000 signatures that can allow this to be discussed in Parliament. The British government owes Zimbabwe reparations. The British government owes Zimbabwe compensation of its own children, and it owes compensation to us for the damages that were upon and visited upon our ancestors during this crime against humanity called colonization, during the enslavement of our ancestors, and during the dispossession of our land for 90 years. The fact that most of us Zimbabweans don't talk about these kind of things is concerning. It's concerning because we purport to be educated, we purport to have read history, we understand the precedents set in history, we understand that the Jews were compensated, we understand the French were compensated, we understand that the British and the Americans themselves who went to war were compensated, but our ancestors who went to fight the Second World War, even the First World War, were never compensated, but they were given suits while others were given land. Our land was used to pay white Britons for their contribution to the Second World War. But our uncles, our ancestors, our grandfathers were given walking sticks and suits. And they remained dispossessed of their land. They remained poverty-stricken. They remained without jobs. All these are things that we should remedy because they were never remedied. And if the British are going to hold us accountable for paying damages or compensation to their children to the tune of $7 billion, we have every right to also want compensation, reparations for the war effort, for the massacre and genocide upon our people, because more than 50,000 people died in trying to liberate Zimbabwe, from the first Chimurenga to the second Chimurenga. It is critical that as Africans, we stop waiting for somebody to fight our fights for us. It's time that we start fighting our fights for ourselves. And we need to start fighting our fights by using the mechanisms that they've got. It's bad enough that international law does not recognize African law. Instead, they institute laws, they institute treaties, and they institute precedences that were set way before Africans even had independence to be able to sit and negotiate to determine how this international law was going to be. So currently we don't use international law, we actually use European law. We actually use the law of discovery that actually enabled the colonization of Africa and the rest of the world legally, according to the agreements that have been made by Europeans. But there cannot be any binding agreement that does not consider the people with whom you make the agreements. So we need to challenge this. But I'm not a legal mind. There are legal minds who are well educated in the West who should be taking this cause up. There are people that should be writing the documents, because international law is also amended by new laws that are written and proposed and peer-reviewed to get into the system. And these are the things that we are supposed to be doing. Now, my final point on this issue. While our president has been going all around the world on a charm offensive, negotiating with the West, these points are never brought up. I don't hear Muchangwa saying it, I don't hear the president saying it. And there can only be a few reasons why that is. Either our leaders are dumb, or our leaders are under duress and unable to argue some of these issues out because the people that they're negotiating with are holding them by the balls. This has been happening for a while. That also means that any contracts that are being signed, any agreements that are being made now under duress with their balls in a vice are not binding upon the people of Zimbabwe. They are actually voidable. They are illegal contracts because there can be no contract signed under duress. There can be no contract that is signed with an authority utilizing their authority in bad faith over the person that they're negotiating with. And there can be no contract where there's no consensus ad idem or agreement or meeting of the minds. A lot of the contracts that Africa signs have no meeting of the minds. But there are leaders that are pushed in those situations. Mnangagwa always has the issue of Gukura Hundi being threatened upon his head, even though he has never been taken into a court to test whether the allegations are correct. There are other allegations of Muramba China that are also charged on him. And so Mnangagwa's personal problems are used as leverage to make a country make decisions that are going to bind an entire nation because of an individual's own personal problems. That is illegal. Surely there has to be a mechanism in which a country can make decisions separated from its leaders' personal choices, personal activities, or personal problems. And any contracts that are made because of a leader being put in a corner surely can't be binding. There is no difference between those contracts and the contract that was signed with Lobengula that was fraudulent. It's about time that we start challenging some of these things, writing petitions to the British government and utilizing the ability to write legal argument to start challenging these things. I can frame this in the way I'm framing it, but I'm not a legal mind. It'll still take legal minds that understand international law, human rights law, to take this up and create white papers, documents, proposals, and challenges to the legal system, to the international court, and other bodies that can be challenged to change the precedent. We always talk about how Zimbabwe used to be the breadbasket of Africa. But do you realize that when we were the breadbasket of Africa, Zimbabweans were dying of kwashiorkor, they were dying of beriberi, they were dying of marasmus, they were dying of elephantiasis and a lot of other food deficiency diseases because the food that we were growing was not for the benefit of the black Rhodesian. It was not for the benefit of the Zimbabwean, but it was enjoyed only by white Zimbabweans. The revenue was used to develop white Zimbabweans and to develop England. We even had a time where we had to bail out England in its own food deficiency crisis by growing food in Zimbabwe, sending it to England, and starving the people of Zimbabwe. We're not the only people that went through this. Close to 10 million Indians died because of the very same thing. Food was grown in India and exported to the United Kingdom for the war effort, and Indians died. But these are injustices that the world knows. Why do we not do something about it? Why do we talk about holding people accountable for Gukura Hundi, but never accountable for these injustices, for colonization, and for the wars that our people were taken into for trying to demand the human right of freedom? Now, I know a lot of Zimbabweans don't find this as important. But trust me, if we don't learn to start dealing with these issues as societies and as the public, to start challenging those that are holding our leaders to ransom, those that are holding our leaders by the balls, if we as society don't rise up to start speaking and making those injustices known, we will always have a situation we are unable to redeem ourselves from colonialism and neo-colonialism. This is why I'm talking. This is why I'm challenging us to do this. And not only was our land taken for farming, but our land was also taken for the development of properties that are still owned today in our country by Britons. We still got property in Zimbabwe today owned by the Rhodes Trust. How can that be possible? Yet that land was stolen. How can buildings, some of the dilapidating buildings that you see in Zimbabwe, are deliberately being let to be dilapidated by owners who are in England, who are waiting for rezoning rights, or who are waiting for a time when they will dispose of those buildings when they feel like it? But those are buildings that were built off a crime. How is it that they've remained in British hands? How is it that we continue to look at the British tenure system as the means by which Zimbabwe determines its tenure, as if our ancestors never had a tenure before? Guys, I'm done. I do see you in the comments. The reason I don't take time anymore to greet you is that I try to make messages that won't be too long so that you can be able to share these messages for other people to learn. Good night, and thank you.